Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining our first session of History for Shut-ins. A couple of housekeeping tips for those that are joining live or those that are going to watch the tape delay. Feel free to send me a question at any point during the presentation. If you're watching this on tape delay, feel free to ask me a question at that point, and I will get back to you before tomorrow's class. I want to thank several people who have been big inspirations in getting this started. Ned and Mary Johnson out of Royal Oak, Michigan. I'd also like to thank Mason Roseman here in Philadelphia, and one Jack Milius of Havertown. So we're going to start. As I said, our first session or our first course, which would probably take 5 to 6 days, is going to be on the Revolution. And we're going to talk about revolutionary mothers and fathers, those individuals, some well-known, some not very well-known, who played a big role in the Revolution, both beforehand and then during the Revolution itself. Today, I'm going to say about the Revolution, and tomorrow we'll talk more about individuals and the roles that they played. So, what you want to do, so the Revolution starts with Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. You actually want to go back to 1756, which is the 7 Years' War between England, France, Spain's involved, Native Americans are involved, and of course the colonists are involved here in America. The 7 Years' War is fought between those superpowers, and it truly is the First World War. And what they're fighting over basically is land around Detroit, really to Pittsburgh, that Ohio River Valley. And they're fighting for navigation of the waterways, but they're also fighting for rich natural resources, which the colonies have, and of course, the more developed countries of Europe do not have. Because of the war, the British government goes deeply into debt, and they're thinking of ways, of course, as part of the empire, they have the colonies, but they are the bee's knees as far as world powers in the mid-1700s, with Spain and France right there as well, also the Dutch, and the Dutch more from a trading standpoint. Parliament in Great Britain enacted a series of measures to help to increase tax revenues from the colonies. There are several theories. Of course, in school we learned about taxation without representation, and that being a big reason for the Revolution getting underway. The way the colonists looked at it is they were more concerned about losing their rights, both land rights and individual rights, to the British. So what Parliament does as a way to generate revenue to pay for not only the debt incurred during the 7 Years' War, but also to take care of the colonies, through governance and those sorts of things, is they put through a series of acts. One of the most famous ones is the Stamp Act of 1765, which comes into play shortly after the 7 Years' War ends in 1763. Pardon me for a little Mr. Rogers moment here, and I'll take off my jacket. You can see my shirt. I won't show you my taking off of my shoes. But so Parliament puts through the Stamp Act of 1765, and basically what they do is they put a small tax on everything. A stamp is required on newspapers, correspondence, playing cards, really any paper item used in the colonies. And it's a very nominal tax, but it's the first in a line of acts that the colonies call the Intolerable Acts. which really lead us over the next decade to the revolution in 1775. There are protests throughout the colonies, and really the protests start in New England. Think of the colonies at the time. Where are the major cities? They're surrounded, or they are anchored by ports. Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Philadelphia at the time actually has the #1 port in the colonies and one of the top 2 or 3 ports in the entire world. Of course, New York will take that over. But these major cities that have ports where goods are coming in that require the stamps, they are the first to get upset with and really stir up trouble. So the colonies repeal, or not repeal, but they lead protests against the Stamp Act, which leads to the repeal of the Stamp Act and also the Townsend Act, Townshend, named for a gentleman in Parliament who put through other acts as way to generate revenue for the crown. What the colonists then do, and we'll talk more about it, of course, is you have the forming of the Continental Congress, you have Lexington and Concord, and then the revolution gets underway. Many historians, and more so lately, and when I say lately, probably within the last 20 to 30 years, have really focused on the role of women in the revolution. You have, the Cokie Roberts book, Revolutionary Mothers, which talks about some of the, again, well-known names of those women who were involved, Abigail Adams and such, Martha Washington. But there are also some other names that we'll discuss over the next several days, which you may not have heard of, but their contributions are just as important. Because men are the primary fighters during the war and serving in the Continental Congress, women are taking on roles, compare it, if you will, to World War I, to World War II, when women go to work in factories because men are away fighting. Women are taking over the family farm. They might be taking over their husband or their father's businesses. So it's an expansion of rights. And again, we're talking 1800s, the 18th century, where women's rights, we're still 200 years. I was a history major, not a math major, not quite 200 years until women have the right to vote. So the war gave women the opportunity to demonstrate the capacity to assume responsibilities that were largely considered male responsibilities. They defended their homes and neighborhoods because, of course, the British, starting in New England, are marching through towns, through Lexington and Concord and Boston, and then New York and Philadelphia, moving down south. As men are away fighting, women are the ones who are defending their homes or may be defending a town. They also gather intelligence. They serve as spies during the revolution. They serve as maids to the army. They travel with the army. They cook for the army. They also act as nurses for the army. And several, which again we'll talk about in more detail over the coming days, served as soldiers on the battlefield. So although most women were non-combatants, they were subjected to the consequences of war, suffering, violence, death. During this time, you have smallpox making its way through the colonies. George Washington almost dies of smallpox years before, and somewhat ironic because of what we're currently going through. But the way that you would be vaccinated, so to speak, against smallpox is you would be given smallpox, and the hope is if you survive, then you are then immune to it. Many people died because of it. Women struggled to maintain their homesteads as fighting raged nearby. Also, enemy troops raping women during the war. It was a big possibility and a source of fear for women defending their homes. Ordinary domestic behaviors become charged with political significance during the war. You have all sorts of support being expressed through the home, through the domestic economy, And as I said earlier, through their through their husbands' or fathers' businesses. There was a movement called the Homespun Movement, where this was a form of protest that women started. Many of the economy of the colonies in the 1700s, pre-revolution, is very artisanal. Seagrave Daily men probably would not have survived because we were not very handy. So, you had to make your own tools, you had to make your own clothes. If you were a person of means, you would import items in from Great Britain and France. Think of Washington and Jefferson and some of the founders. What they used to pay for these goods were their crops. Now, if you have a bad harvest, you've already purchased items and you've said, I'm going to give you half of my tobacco harvest, and it doesn't quite come to be, so you're now in debt. But with John Q. Public and Mary Q. Public, they are, rather than buying things from the British as a form of protest, what they're doing is they're making their own clothes. And this is called the Homespun Movement. In 1767 is when the Townsend Acts are passed. It increased duties on manufactured goods. So what did the colonies do? Now they're under colonial rule with colonial governors who are, allied to the king. They passed non-importation duties and rules. Instead of purchasing clothing made of imported British materials, patriot women rely on their own resources. And homespun, what it is, it's basically a plain weave cloth made at home. So they are, in addition to boycotting textiles, and of course, what is one of the main ingredients used in British textiles? Southern cotton, ironically enough. So instead of, using textiles, the Homespun Movement, what they do is they serve the Continental Army by producing clothing and blankets for the soldiers. During the Revolution, think of during any war, more recently, a more recent example, think of the first Iraq War. Or actually the last Iraq War in the early 2000s. What do we call French fries? We call them freedom fries. And what are people doing? They're trying to buy domestically. Same thing happens pre-revolution. People are saying, I would rather buy my goods domestically, even though they're not as good, as a way to hit the British in the pocketbook. So this is something that's been in our DNA, not only our DNA, every belligerent country's DNA since jump. The tea boycott is really the number one thing that people think of, the Boston Tea Party. Robin, thanks for mentioning the flag backdrop. Extra credit for anybody who can tell me what group of colonists used this flag without Googling it. And I'll just keep talking. You can feel free to go on from there. But women, what they did, so you have the Boston Tea Party in 1773. It was actually very easy to smuggle or to buy smuggled tea. The tea in the Boston Tea Party is coming from the Dutch East India Company, which is sending money hand over fist to the crown. And of course, tea at the time is the number one consumed beverage in the colonies. That's changed a little bit to all great. Women, what they do to help the Patriots' various causes, is here in Philadelphia and really throughout the colonies. What they do is they create organizations. There's one in Philadelphia that was created. It was called the Ladies Association. And what it did is it recognized the capacity of every woman to contribute to the war effort. The women in Philadelphia, in the association, collected money to assist in the war effort. Martha Washington brings this information to George, of course, who's the commander of colonial forces. Other states followed the example set by the founders of the Ladies Association in Philadelphia are Sarah Franklin Bache, who is the daughter of Benjamin Franklin, and Esther DeBert Reed, another big name in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania politics. In 1780 alone, the colonies raised more than $340,000 through these various ladies' associations in the colonies. So Washington, of course, with Martha in his ear saying, hey, include the ladies, and of course it's Abigail Adams who writes to John during the Constitutional Convention saying, don't forget the ladies. Washington is confronting the issue of using women in the war effort early in the Revolution, because initially, after that first bolus of patriotism and people are joining with, like every war, most people joining think this is going to be a quick war. Great Britain at the time has the world's best army and navy. So they're thinking they're going to mop the decks with the colonists. And the colonists are thinking if we get them on our home turf, it will take one quick, decisive battle. Of course, the revolution starts in April 1775. Yorktown doesn't happen until October 1781, and the Paris Peace Treaty ending the revolution officially isn't signed until 1783. So we have a ways to go here. So Washington needs for any help that he can get, and early on with the fall of New York, with just colonial loss after colonial loss, soldiers, and really it's militiamen because there's no true continental army, and the militias are run by states. Governors are more powerful than Congress at this time because there's no real national government. So if the war is going badly, as it was initially, then governors are saying, you know what, I'm bringing my militia home, or I'm not going to fund the revolution. I'm going to hold back food. I'm going to hold back gunpowder and materials and those sorts of things. What Washington does is he sets up a medical corps comprised of male physicians, female nurses. What he wanted to do is have one nurse for every 10 sick or wounded colonial soldiers. Nurses were paid initially $2 a month and one daily ration, which sounds crazy by today's standards. In 1777, they actually upped the pay to $8 a month and one daily ration. Of course, the problem during the war is that the colonists or Congress can't raise money. So they're going to the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, you name it, asking for loans. And of course, these world powers are lending money to the colonies, not because they want to see a democracy set up. They want the British to get kicked in the teeth, and then they'll pick up the pieces of the British Empire. So throughout the Revolution, you have many women who followed the army, serving soldiers and officers, as I said before, cooks, nurses, washerwomen, seamstresses, spies, and such. If you were a camp follower, it really was not a favored way of life. Many of the wives, daughters, and mothers of soldiers thought that they would be safer with the army than they would on their homesteads or farms. Often poor, they were unable to support themselves without their husband's income, so they would join the camps. And of course, as we know, a la Valley Forge, the colonial army had their own problems being fed and clothed and so forth. So, as a camp follower, a woman was actually paid a small wage, and she was given a half ration a day, which during some times, especially Valley Forge, was probably a feast, as it was very difficult for Washington to get the support of Congress because, again, state governors had so much more power than Congress at this time because we really don't have a national government in. So, what we have is there was a group that was formed by women called the Republican Motherhood. And what it did is it assigned women the responsibility for the moral training of their sons for citizenship, say that 5 times fast, and led to the growth of educational opportunities for women. Think of, the educational system in America at the time. If you were a family of means, sons, sorry ladies, were educated by a local pastor, they might intern with a local lawyer, those sorts of things. Women were rarely educated. But as the war and the revolution grew, the Republican Motherhood is formed because they see the importance that women play, much like we are today. Women are today and families are today, with schools being shut down. Incredible respect, more respect now for teachers than perhaps people have had before, as we're all homeschooling. Hopefully this counts for an hour of time for your kids with their school. But the Republican Motherhood, what happens is they use republicanism, and our country really is set up as a republic. It's not a democracy, it's a republic. So what does republicanism mean? It stresses liberty, rights, and the rule of law as central values. It makes the people as a whole sovereign, so the will of the people. It rejects inherited political power, so kings and queens and those sorts of things. It expects citizens to be independent in their performance of civic duties and is supposedly strongly inclined against corruption. Abigail Adams becomes one of the first leading voices of the Republican Motherhood. She, as I said earlier, says to John, hey, remember the ladies when you're drawing up the new government. We're starting from scratch here, so let's try to cure some of the ills of earlier society. Of course, our government is, ironically enough, set up on the English system of government, with pieces taken from Rome and the Greeks and so forth. Ministers and the church play a big role in pre-revolutionary America. And what is Massachusetts when it's founded? It's a Puritan colony. So they preach the superiority, the moral superiority, sorry, women, of men. However, the Enlightenment is going on at this time. Locke and Bacon and those sorts of thinkers, European thinkers, who reject the moral superiority of men. And they say that a republic can only succeed if its citizens were virtuous and educated. All citizens, men and women. Women are the primary caretakers of children. So if the republic is to succeed, women must be schooled in virtue so that they could teach their children the same. The first female academies set up in the United States are actually founded in the 1790s, after the Constitution's been signed. So this idea of an educated woman is what becomes known as the Republican Motherhood. As in the case, I should say, with the abolition of slavery, changes for women don't come overnight. But the revolution puts women's rights, and again, it's all relatively speaking, in a new light. Education and respect for women would lead to the emergence of a powerful, outspoken middle class of women. The Industrial Revolution opens up opportunities for women as we move into the next century. The legal rights of colonial women are few, unfortunately. Men dominated society, and women were subservient to the men in her family, such as her mother and brothers. Divorce was practically unknown. Colonial America was basically a divorce-free country. Colonial women did not have the rights to vote. They could not hold public office. They could not serve on juries. Widows and unmarried women could make a will. They could buy or sell property. They could act as a guardian. They could sue or be sued, and they would receive a 1/3 interest in the personal property of their husband who would die before them. They would get half of the interest if there were no children. Colonial woman married, her legal identity virtually disappeared. The legal existence of the woman was suspended during the marriage. Any property or goods, including livestock and money, left to a married woman in a will also was owned by the husband. Best example of this, think of George Washington. Now, Martha is one of the richest women in Virginia because of her first marriage and her husband, George Custis. When he dies and Martha marries, or Custis, pardon me, when he dies and Martha and George Washington marry, George brings some material to the marriage, but Martha brings the bulk of it, and then George assumes control of it through the marriage. A husband owned whatever belonged to his wife except for personal items such as clothes and jewelry. Kids legally belonged to their fathers. Married women had fewer rights than unmarried women or widows. They could not make a will without the explicit consent of their husband. They could not buy property. They could not make a contract, and they could not sue or be sued in court. These are married women. So, again, just setting the table for what we're going to be talking about over the next few days. So I didn't see an answer, but the flag behind me was used by a patriot organization called the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were a well-organized paramilitary political organization that really has been shrouded in secrecy. It was established to undermine British rule in the colonies and was influential in organizing and carrying out the Tea Party. The origins and founding of the Sons of Liberty is unclear. The earliest known references to the organization are in 1765 in Boston and New York. More likely than not, historians think the Boston and New York chapters of the Sons of Liberty were deliberately established at the same time and basically worked as an underground network in conjunction with each other. It's believed that the Sons of Liberty was formed out of earlier, smaller scale, like-minded organizations such as the Boston Caucus Club or the Loyal Nine. Membership was made up of males from all walks of colonial society, but they did a lot of their recruiting in taverns, which may be why it's one of my favorite colonial organizations, and wars. But think about it. During the Revolution, leading up to the Revolution, two of the most influential areas in society are taverns and churches, where all these ideas are being shared and cooked up. So under the cover of darkness, the Boston chapter of the Sons of Liberty held their meetings under what was called the Liberty Tree. The New York chapter held theirs under what was called the Liberty Pole. The Liberty Tree was located in Hanover Square in Boston and was actually a 120-year-old elm. Taverns and the tavern owners loved holding meetings for the Sons of Liberty because, of course, it put rear ends in the seats in taverns. Again, think of today. With coronavirus, we're not allowed to be in taverns or groups of more than 10 or 50 or whatever it may be. But the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston was the tavern for meetings of the Sons of Liberty. The Francis Tavern in New York, which is still functioning, was a colonial tavern which played a huge role in the Revolution. Despite very little evidence, Sam Adams is often credited as being the founder and leader of the Sons of Liberty. Hello, Ava, and hello, Jack Milius. The Sons of Liberty was most likely organized in the summer of 1765 as a means to protest the passing of the Stamp Act. The name actually comes from a 1765 debate that took place in Parliament under the Stamp Act. And there were two members of Parliament. One, his name is Isaac Barry, for whom the great city of Wilkes-Barre is named. Isaac Barry was pro-colonist. He is saying to the king and to Parliament, let these guys have their own deal, if you will, over in the colonies. We are stretched thin. We can't afford to take care of them. So let them set up their own systems. However, he is shot down. In his speech, Isaac Berry calls the colonists, quote, the Sons of Liberty. Of course, he's shouted down. The first major action of the Sons of Liberty is in Boston on August 14th, 1765. And it's in response to the Stamp Act. Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty gather under the old Liberty Tree, and there's an effigy of Andrew Oliver, who is the public official in charge of enforcing the Stamp Act in Massachusetts. Incited by the Sons of Liberty, a crowd of thousands gathers and a sign is placed on the effigy of Mr. Oliver, stating, quote, he that takes this down is an enemy to his country, unquote. The angry mob, which has had a bit of spirits, to say the least, parades the effigy throughout Boston. They march to the home of Oliver. They tear down his fence. They smash his windows. They basically loot and destroy his home. And they also find the wine cellar, which they empty. Oliver, ironically enough, was not a proponent of the Stamp Act. On the 17th of August, so a few days after his home is ransacked, he resigns his commission. On December 17th, the Sons of Liberty made him publicly swear an oath that he would never again serve as stamp master. The next target of the Sons of Liberty is Thomas Hutchinson, who's the Lieutenant Governor and Chief Justice of Massachusetts at the time. He's a loyalist, so he's loyal to the king. In 1764, he publishes a history of Massachusetts condemning the 1689 revolt by Boston citizens against the rule of a then unpopular governor by the name of Sir Edmund Andros. On the evening of August 15th, 1865, the Sons of Liberty, and others go to the mansion of Hutchinson. They surround it, and they demand that he denounce the Stamp Act in his official letters to London. Hutchinson tells them to go jump in Boston Harbor. On the night of August 26th, a mob ransacks Hutchinson's mansion. Hutchinson, ironically enough, is reimbursed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony for the damages. He and his family then move to Castle William in Boston Harbor as a result of this. As tensions in the colonies grow on the eve of the Revolution, chapters of the Sons of Liberty start to sprout up throughout the colonies. The Sons of Liberty adopt in 1767 the red and white striped vertical flag behind me as their organization's formal standard. It looks similar to the U.S. flag, of course, without the blue and the stars, but it also looks a heck of a lot like English flags that are used at the time. The Sons of Liberty is influential in orchestrating effective resistance movements against the British throughout the colonies, primarily against what they perceived as not only unfair taxation, but various financial limitations imposed upon them by the British. After the Boston Massacre, what do the British do? They close down the port of Boston, which is one of the biggest ports in the colony. So no goods are coming in or out. Through mob rule, fear, force, intimidation, and violence, tarring and feathering, as an example, what the Sons of Liberty would do, they stockpile arms, they stockpile shot and gunpowder, and they do their best to undermine British rule throughout the colonies. The Sons of Liberty disband at the end of the Revolution. As a political entity, it is replaced early in the Revolution by more formal and qualified committees of safety, which may ring a bell to some of you. So each state then has committees of safety, which communicate between colonies on strategy and government and those sorts of things. The seminal act and lasting legacy of the Sons of Liberty is, of course, the Boston Tea Party, which takes place on December 16th, 1773. The Tea Party is a catalyst for the start of the war, and really one of the principal reasons why the war starts in Massachusetts. We're going to move on to, we're actually going to start, if you have any questions, please ask. And yes, Ned, I will wear my Carson Wentz t-shirt for you, so tune in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with one of my favorite people to talk about in the Revolution, Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine is born in 1737, dies in 1809, and this is where we'll end when I'm finished talking about Paine. Paine is a British and U.S. writer, author of Common Sense, which is a pamphlet, and of course the Crisis Papers, American Crisis Papers, which were important influences on the Revolution. After the American Revolution, he writes The Rights of Man, which is a defense of the French Revolution and of Republican principles. He writes The Age of Reason, which is an exposition of the place of religion in society. I highly recommend reading Common Sense. It might be 50 to 55 pages. You can get it at your local library. It's still a great read today, really inspiring and gives you insight to the way that, Paine helped to set the table really for thought. Up until Common Sense is written, most colonials, Ben Franklin, Jefferson, the heavy hitters of the Revolution still consider themselves English. It takes common sense to move the needle. And also, what Common Sense does is Paine takes no money for it because he wants cheap copies to be printed so that people can read it throughout the colonies. 500,000 copies are printed. It's really one of the first bestsellers outside of the Bible in our country's history. Paine is born to a Quaker father and Anglican mother. He has meager formal education, basically learns how to master reading, writing, and arithmetic. He, at 13, begins work with her as a corset maker, tries several other, actually, Deanna, it was the American Crisis #1 that was recited to you, and that's what we're going to end with, so how about that? So Paine is working with his father, and they have several unsuccessful businesses. Paine, ironically enough, works for the crown and works to collect excise taxes on liquor and tobacco. The pay was not good, and what he does is he uses part of his earnings to find or to purchase books and different scientific apparatus. Paine has 2 brief marriages. He's unsuccessful. He's happy with his jobs. And what happened in 1782, he writes a pamphlet to the British government saying, hey, if you paid those of us working to collect excise taxes more, it would be much more successful. Of course, the crown tells him to go jump in a lake. So what happens is Paine meets Ben Franklin in London. Ben Franklin says, hey, go over to the colonies to make your fortune. Franklin writes letters of introduction to Paine, including one to Franklin's son-in-law, Richard Bache. Very interesting Seagrave Daily family fact, and because it's my little Facebook Live, I'm going to bore you with this. But my grandfather, so my dad's dad, came over he's born in England in 1901. He comes over to the States in the early 1920s and brings with him letters of introduction written by the Don of Oxford, where he attended. So pretty cool stuff. I actually have it hanging up in my dining room here. But anyway, so Paine arrives in Philadelphia November 30th of 1774. Richard Bache introduces him to Robert Aitken, Aitkin, who has a magazine called Pennsylvania Magazine. Paine helped edit it for 18 months. Paine publishes numerous articles, some under his name, some anonymously. Paine writes one article titled, quote, African Slavery in America, unquote, which is a scathing denunciation of the African slave trade. And he signs it as the author, Justice and Humanity. So Paine gets to the U.S. as things are really boiling up. We've got about 5 more minutes, folks, and then we'll end. So after the battles of Lexington and Concord, which take place on April 19th, 1775, Paine argues that the cause of the colonies should be not just a revolt against taxation, but a demand for independence. And it's Lexington and Concord that moves some of the thought leaders with Paine. He puts this idea into Common Sense, which is written and published almost 6 months before the Declaration of Independence. It's a 50-page pamphlet. More than any other single publication, Common Sense paves the way for the Declaration of Independence. During the war, Paine serves as aide-de-camp to General Nathaniel Greene. He writes 16 crisis papers between 1776 and 1783 and signs each one Common Sense. American Crisis number 1 is published on December 19, 1776. What happens less than a week later? Washington crosses the Delaware and wins the Battle of Trenton, wins it at Princeton, and really turns the tide, at least for a short period, turns the tide of the revolution because he's losing recruits left and right. This helps to keep his army intact and draw new recruits. Also gains the attention of some of the world powers. So in the Common Sense, in American Crisis number 1, which Washington reads to his troops before they cross the Delaware, here's the quote, and this is what I read to my wife. So romantic from a historical nerd standpoint. Quote, these are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this case, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands in it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated, unquote. That's the first paragraph. Good, thanks, Dave. In 1777, Congress appoints Paine Secretary to the Committee for Foreign Affairs. He holds the post until 1779, when he becomes involved in a controversy with another founder, Silas Deane, who's a member of the Continental Congress. Paine accuses Deane of seeking to profit from French aid to the United States. Get in line, Allie. The way that he's able to find this out is he has access to secret documents. Once Congress finds out that he gets this information basically through illegal means, he's forced to resign from his post. Paine is then appointed clerk of the General Assembly of Pennsylvania, November 2nd of 1779. He has frequent opportunity to see that U.S. troops were at the end of their patience because of a lack of pay, lack of supplies. Paine takes $500 from his salary and starts a subscription for the relief of soldiers. In 1781, he accompanies John Lawrence to France to get money, clothing, all these sorts of things for the colonial soldiers. Paine appeals to the separate states to cooperate for the well-being of the entire nation. In 1780, he writes an article called The Public Good, which he says, basically, we have to fix the Articles of Confederation, which gave the states more power, and establish a strong central government under a continental constitution. Of course, Alexander Hamilton is screaming in the background because he agrees wholeheartedly. At the end of the Revolution, Paine finds himself poverty-stricken. His patriotic writings, as I said, sold hundreds of thousands, but he refused to accept any profits in order that cheap editions could be widely circulated. In a petition to Congress endorsed by Washington, he pleads for financial assistance. Congress basically ignores it, but Pennsylvania gives him £100, and the state of New York gives him a farm in New Rochelle. Paine, after the Revolution, one almost buys it during the French Revolution, is almost guillotined, but survives. And then he devotes his time to inventions when it comes to America, such as a smokeless candle, an iron bridge without piers, things of the like. So that is where we're going to end today. We'll pick up tomorrow talking about Abigail Adams. Again, if you have questions, feel free to post them here for those that are watching live or those that are watching late. I will sign on early tomorrow to allow people to gather, probably by about 11:57, and we'll start at noon sharp. Thanks again for joining History for Shut-In, the first edition, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Have a great day and stay safe.